theme for this meditation is hypocrisy, and it is taken from Luke chapter 11, verses 37 to 54. In this passage, we see Jesus going to the house of a Pharisee for dinner. Upon arriving at the house, Jesus goes straight inside and reclines at the table. We can see that this surprises the Pharisee, who was expecting to see Jesus first wash his hands before sitting down. This was due to the tradition of ritual cleansing practiced by the Pharisees in those days. Jesus, however, saw it for what it really was: a way for the Pharisees to feel good and holy about themselves, without actually doing anything meaningful. He compares them to a cup that is only clean on the outside, telling them that they are in reality full of wickedness and greed. He tells them that in order to be clean, they must care for others and be willing to give what they have to help those in need. Jesus then continues disciplining the Pharisees in verses 42 and 43. He calls them out on how they donate without any real love for God or for justice, how they like to sit in the best places in the synagogue, and how they enjoy receiving special greetings from the people. This is to highlight how every action they take is to present a respectable image on the outside, without any real meaningful qualities on the inside. The Pharisees were more concerned with looking holy rather than actually being holy. They were concerned about how their followers would perceive them. Their end goal was the approval of others. This is why they tried so hard to follow all their laws and traditions. It made them look more important and religious. He goes on in verse 44 to remark that they're like unmarked graves. This is quite an insulting thing to say, and we see one of the experts in the law object in verse 45. The reason they found this so offensive was because to a Pharisee, walking on a grave was considered as an act that made a person unclean. This law was not created to honor the dead, but rather to maintain their status and position. The book of Leviticus is clear that to touch a dead animal or a dead person was to become unclean. The Pharisees added to it by saying to walk over someone's grave was to become unclean. So all over the city, people were accidentally walking over graves, and they were now being told that they were unclean. Jesus declares that in fact it is the Pharisees who are the unmarked graves, making the people unclean through their teachings and their leadership. The people thought that the Pharisees could lead them to God, but in reality they were being led further away. Moving along to verse 46, Jesus goes on to admonish the lawyers and the other experts in law. He's angry with them for joining the Pharisees in further burdening the people with man-made laws and traditions. These not only make the people's lives harder, but also distracts them from the true word of God. God has set rules for his people to follow in order for them to grow closer to him. Adding man-made traditions to God's law just served to confuse and muddle what God requires from his people. On top of that, the lawyers did not assist the people in following the law. They just sat back and allowed the people to struggle, many a times while not even following all the laws themselves. Jesus disliked their complacency and the apathy they had to the actual welfare of the people they were supposed to be leading and taking care of. Verses 47 to 51 is once again a challenge to the Pharisees and the lawyers, calling them out for their outward actions. Jesus talks about how these leaders present themselves as supportive of the prophets, when it was the ancestors of these same leaders that opposed those prophets and killed them. The Pharisees and the lawyers pretend to care about God's words, while behaving in the same manner as their forefathers. Even though they have invited Jesus to dine with them, it is all for show, and they instead resist his teachings. Throughout this whole passage, we can see that Jesus lays bare the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the other leaders of Israel. They twisted the word of God and led the people of Israel further away from him, just to further their own social standing and make themselves appear more respectable than they actually were. As we enter this Lenten season, we must ask ourselves, are we being like the Pharisees? Do we actually follow the word of God, or are we just pretending? If so, we must use this time of Lent to realize what God has called us to do, and to correct our actions in a meaningful way, rather than pursue activities that just serve to make others approve of us.